I'd like to share with you a story from the Bible about a wealthy man. This wealthy man is probably not who you think it is. In Genesis 17, God makes a promise to a wealthy man, Abraham. This promise will become a central theme for the rest of the Old Testament and foundational for the development of both Judaism and Christianity. What does God promise to this man? It really comes down to two things. First, he promises many descendants, so many that they will become nations. And second, God promises the land of Canaan. So lots and lots of kids and lots of land. Basically, God says to Abraham, I'm going to make you very wealthy. Now, by the time of Genesis 17, Abraham had already been on quite a journey with God. He migrated from Ur of the Chaldeans, modern-day Iraq. He made his way through what is now Turkey and Israel and Egypt. He escaped precarious situations. We often think of Abraham as vulnerable, and that is certainly true in some respects. But we also should note that by Genesis 17, Abraham was 99 years old, and he was already very wealthy. When God called, Abraham did not migrate alone, but he went with family and possessions. And these possessions seemed to get bigger and bigger as he traveled to the west. Genesis 13 describes Abraham as rich in livestock, silver, and gold. So in a way, it is a bit surprising that to this already wealthy man, God promises to make him even more wealthy with many descendants and fertile land. This covenant with Abraham is described in only 2 chapters of the Old Testament, Genesis 15 and Genesis 17. But the Abrahamic covenant occupies a major role throughout the entire Bible. The rest of the book of Genesis will focus on the next 3 generations of Abraham in relation to this promise. The Bible then continues to the story of Moses, which spans 4 books, and it follows a narrative of getting all of these descendants of Abraham into the land of Canaan. The land is described as a land flowing with milk and honey. The biblical accounts of King David describe ways that God delivers on this covenantal promise. In 2 Samuel 7, God declares that he will provide protection for David from all enemies, and that a house or a dynasty will be established forever. Among other things, this certainly implies that the Davidic dynasty will be very, very wealthy. And in 1 Kings, we see how this wealth in the description of the reign of Solomon explodes. David's son Solomon is explicitly granted enormous wealth. A house made of cedar imported from the Phoenicians, massive quantities of luxurious goods, gifts coming from afar, foreign workers and dignitaries. Several of the Psalms also refer to the Abrahamic covenant, and many of these Psalms plainly state that God's blessing comes in the form of material goods. For example, Psalm 112 states that for those who fear the Lord, wealth and riches are in their house. The book of Proverbs, a wisdom book, is filled with advice on how to become prosperous. Many Christians will be very familiar, perhaps have memorized Proverbs 3:5, which begins, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart." But if you keep on reading Proverbs 3, you'll get to the promise in verse 10. "Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine." Even the prophets present a similar message. Some are well known for their protests against injustice, but within these messages, they also promote the concept of wealth as divine blessing. A particularly famous phrase is found in Isaiah 66:12, as the Lord declares, "I will extend prosperity to her like a river, and the wealth of nations like an overflowing stream." In the Bible, teachings on wealth and poverty cover a wide range of genres and historical contexts. And I'm thinking of texts like Hosea and Amos, which speak sharply against social injustice. I'm thinking about moments in the Psalms in which the psalmist brings comfort to those who are economically oppressed. I'm thinking of Ruth, which centers on the most disenfranchised figure in the ancient Near East, a foreign widow. I'm conscious of these contexts in which blessing comes in the form of economic prosperity, similar to Abraham. When God makes his covenantal promise to Abraham, God is essentially giving the two most important economic resources known to ancient Israel: descendants and land. These are two critical elements for economic livelihood in an agrarian setting. But the New Testament, particularly the Gospels, seem to give a different perspective on wealth. You see this from Jesus' humble beginnings, being born in a manger. Throughout his ministry, Jesus frequently borrowed from others, depending on need, whether a boat, or borrowing food in the feeding of the masses, or a colt, even his own tomb. Jesus sometimes makes explicit reference to his own economic precarity, claiming foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. In his teachings, Jesus constantly warns against the lure of wealth. Jesus outright says, "It will be hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven." He encourages the rich to sell material goods, to give generously to the poor. And for Jesus, it seems like this was not just about charity, but about one's own spiritual formation. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth," and goes on to explain, "But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven." In Luke 6:20, Jesus begins the Sermon on the Plain by saying, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." This all feels a bit different from the Abrahamic covenant, in which God promises economic blessing through descendants in the land. And the question that I want to pose to you: the promise to Abraham is a pivotal tenet throughout the Old Testament that assures material abundance to Abraham as a sign of the covenant. How do you reconcile this promise to Abraham with the teachings of Jesus in regard to wealth and poverty? How do you reconcile this promise to Abraham with the warnings that Jesus gives against greed, and even the phrase, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God"? I think that part of this answer requires us to take a step back and try to understand the nature of ancient economies. The economy of the Old Testament was nothing like the economy of modern times. Think about the questions facing young people today. These are in many ways economic questions. Where are you going to live? What are you going to do? Who are you going to marry? In antiquity, those questions largely did not exist because they were decided for you from the time of your birth. For example, there were no real estate agents because you lived at your father's estate until you died. Marriage was largely an economic decision. In order to protect bridal gifts and dowries to stay within the family clan, you likely married a distant cousin. And as a side note, I'm guessing your cousins are just as grossed out as you are about this. In the ancient world, there was no college, there were no majors. For the vast majority of people, you did what your family did, which means you worked on the family farm, whether olive orchards or dates, whether growing wheat or catching fish or spinning textiles. In fact, for most of human history, there was no such thing as money. It did not exist. And for much, if not all of the Old Testament, money had not yet been invented. In fact, whenever your English Bibles mention money, it really is a translation for the Hebrew word for silver. And as you know, money and silver are not the same thing. The first coin in the world was minted in 608 BC, and that was all the way in Lydia, modern-day Western Turkey. In Judah, the first coin was not minted until 2 centuries later in 400 BC, and this was long after the time of Abraham, after the time of Moses, and the entire Davidic dynasty. And through archaeology, we know that these coins were extremely rare. They were only used by high-ranking officials, or possibly mercenaries, for specialized use as some sort of royal payment. The vast majority of the population had no access to these coins. So how do you live in a world without money? There were definitely economic transactions. They just didn't involve money. In ancient times, when you pay taxes, whether to a temple or to the Persian government, you paid in commodities, which means you took from your farm shipments of wine and olive oil and wheat, and sometimes you'd give a collection of precious metals. Tax could also be paid in the form of physical labor, usually from young males, sending men from the village to work on government construction, or even sometimes for military duty. Without money, people did not trade so much out of supply and demand, but out of a kinship obligation, out of duty, out of honor. Ancient Israel was largely what anthropologists would describe as a gift economy. We see this throughout the Old Testament. In 1 Kings 10, when the Queen of Sheba brings gifts to Solomon, there is no price negotiation, there's no hint of supply and demand. Rather, she brings gold and spices and precious stones, not expecting anything in return, but she gives this as a gift to Solomon because of his great honor. We see this also with Elijah, who approaches a Phoenician widow in 1 Kings 17. And Elijah asks for some water and for some food, some bread, and she obliges. Again, the text does not use supply and demand, no negotiation, but the text centers on hospitality, the gift of a meal, and aligns this to a bond between this foreign widow and this prophet of the Lord. There are remnants of this gift economy today. One example is a wedding. On a strict utilitarian economic exchange, a wedding is an exchange of an air fryer from Crate and Barrel for a 6-hour dinner and ceremony. There are much more efficient ways to get dinner, but as we know, the exchange of a wedding gift is cultural. It is not bound by supply and demand, but by other considerations, likely some combination of love and obligation. Ancient Israel was kind of like that. It was a gift economy. Coinage was very rare. Economic exchange was governed by factors of honor and culture. The events of the New Testament take place in a very different type of economy. By the time of Jesus, the use of coinage explodes. It is centralized, it is backed by the Roman Empire. To a degree, there are still components of a gift economy, but with coinage, economic transactions are more monetized. Now, the technological innovation of money has many, many benefits. For example, it can be a lot more efficient. If you need olive oil and you only have goat milk, with coinage, you no longer need to roam the neighborhood looking for the perfect match of a household that has excess olive oil but is in need of goat milk. Money allows for much more efficient exchange. Money also allows you to save much more efficiently. Without money, you can still save. Towns could store wheat through silos, but there were limits to saving. Stored commodities had spatial limitations, and they were always subject to spoilage. But silver coins do not spoil, and they take very little space. The wage of an entire month of labor was equivalent to a silver coin of roughly 9 grams. Money allows people to save, but money also allows people to hoard. in greed. The invention of money raised capacities for this greed, and money facilitated higher levels of social stratification and class difference. When you introduce the mechanism of money in a society, wealth looks different. In the Old Testament, your inputs to wealth were primarily your land and your family. In a non-monetized sustenance economy, like in the Old Testament, even with abundant land, you still need to work that land every year. You still need to rely on seasonal rainfall and protection from pestilence. No matter how much the land and children you received, the rhythms of the agricultural calendar gave you a sense of divine provision. Every farmer knows that the most enormous large fertile plot of agricultural land is completely worthless during extended drought. A sense of gratitude can be nurtured every day as you work the field and witness the tiny seeds sprout and lead to harvest, as you watch the livestock reproduce and grow and feed your family. And I think that a pre-modern agrarian farmer, as in the Old Testament, would consider wealth to be God providing your material needs, not in overabundance, but in sustenance, day by day, season by season, and generation by generation. So that every time it rains, every time the first crop begins to appear, every harvest and every meal could be received as an expression of the Abrahamic covenant. I do think that the invention of coinage and the eventual proliferation of money as a technology is very useful. But money can also present an obstacle for us from fully experiencing this covenantal blessing. And I think this is what Jesus is warning us about. I do not see the teachings of Jesus in any tension with the Abrahamic covenant. Rather, I see Jesus as a devout Jew and an expert of the Torah, taking the principles and values of Torah, but contextualizing them for a completely different economy of the Greco-Roman world. Economy that was very much more monetized and therefore had the capacity for greater greed, greater stratification, greater injustice in ways that are not possible in a non-monetized agrarian economy. I'm not advocating for a return to agrarian economies with land-based patrilineal descent. I certainly do not want to directly address the question of whether Jesus was a capitalist or a socialist, or my ridiculous Twitter feed, which once taught me whether Jesus would have totally invested in crypto. I do want to say that Abraham lived in a very different setting than ours, in that in a life of agricultural sustenance, wealth means something very different than what it means within a monetized economy like ours. And that the Abrahamic covenant was never about wealth. It was about faithfully walking with God.